put questions in the chat. If they're time-sensitive ones, I'll be asking Matt those questions, and this is Seal Strauss talking. But we'll save any more complicated questions to the end. And I'll turn it over to Matt. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll get started.
Great, thanks, Seal. Yeah, my name's Matt Bauman. I am a planner with what we call the land use unit in the DNR. I deal with largely, in a nutshell, development near water, but I work with the floodplain program under SEAL, and I also work in the shoreland program as well. And then we also have a few like river related programs, wild and scenic, Mississippi River Corridor, Lower St. Croix. I work with those programs as well. But today I'm going to talk about our new model floodplain ordinance. My background is prior to my time at the DNR, I used to work at the local level too, and we were a floodplain community, but we didn't really have a lot of development in the floodplain. And if you don't have a lot of development in the floodplain, you really don't have a chance to dig into your ordinance to the extent that you would probably like to. The floodplain program is very confusing, and that's why it's very important to have good, solid foundation of a really good ordinance. So this has been an update that we've been wanting to do for some time, and this rollout took some time to see the process through, and I'm going to introduce you to a few of the highlights. Now, we recognize that the program is implemented 100% at the local level. Really, our job is to make your job easier and more understandable. So we're always looking for ways that we can build capacity at the local level. So this is our most significant update to our model ordinance since it was originally created shortly after the rules were rolled out in 1970. Now, we've always treated our model ordinance as a working document. You know, we're always trying to make it better, more understandable, and really no ordinance or rule or statute or law of any sort is perfect, you know, and if they were, we wouldn't have a need for the courts. So really our model is no exception. So we have our ordinance posted on our floodplain ordinances page, and there's 3 different versions of floodplain ordinances. We have our regular version, that's our full version that incorporates all of the basic floodplain standards, and that's probably what 80 or 90% of the communities use. And then we have a simplified version, which is for those communities that don't really have a lot of development potential. It's more restrictive. It's basically a stay out of the floodplain, with the exception of a few basic uses, you know, crossings, you know, open space uses, that sort of thing. Or it might be a community that just has like a small blip of floodplain in their community and it's totally undevelopable. Simplified ordinances for you. Then we have a lot of unmapped communities, and those are communities that do not have a FEMA floodplain map. And in order to get in the National Flood Insurance Program, they still need an ordinance. And this unmapped ordinance is very stripped out, and it has the basic, what they're called 60.3A FEMA standards, and that's basically it, you know, and a community adopts that. And for the most part, there it sits. So the process for a community to update their ordinance is they express interest, or there's a FEMA map update, and then DNR works with them to prepare a customized ordinance for your community. And it's customized based on the type of risk that you have in your community. Do you have A zones? Do you have detailed study areas? Are you a lakes community? Do you have rivers? Now we have these coastal provisions. If you're a community along Lake Superior, you have to adopt these coastal standards, which are similar to those standards that you would have found on the east or west coast. And then we want to make sure that you're referencing your maps accurately. So if you go on this page, you're going to find PDF versions. But if you reach out to the DNR, we would then provide you a customized Word version of your ordinance. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover what our process looked like for this update, why we did the change, the process we went through to update it, as well as a few highlights. So why was the change warranted? Really, there were many confusing concepts in our model floodplain. I mean, floodplain rules, statute, CFR, that's Code of Federal Regulations. There are some very confusing concepts, and to get those simplified in an ordinance to the point where they're plain language, you can read an ordinance and understand it. It's very difficult, and you know, we had made a number of tweaks over the years, but you know, we really had to start from square one. So there's different sources of laws. We have our state rules in Minnesota Rule 6120, and those rules are structured very differently than your basic federal regulations. The basic federal regulations, the bulk of them are in 44 CFR Part 60. And then we have FEMA policy, and FEMA policy has the force of law as well. So most ordinances in the state are based off of some historic version of the state's model. And, you know, I think that if everyone can think of, you know, maybe you have it just on the top of your head, you might have a particular provision in your ordinance that just has never really made a whole lot of sense to you. And, you know, you might have confronted development where that was just confusing. And I have some guesses which of those sections come to mind, because over the years, we've tried to kind of tweak those sections and we've never been 100% satisfied with. So during this presentation, I'm going to talk about what I think a lot of those really challenging standards are. And after this presentation, I want to encourage you to compare the language in your ordinance to the new model. And I think in all cases, I'm hopeful that the new model has clarified these standards. So anyway, moving on. To do our update, we just dove right in. We were analyzing our rules, CFR, FEMA policy, inside and out, line by line. And then we were comparing those to the provisions in the previous model. And we call this our deep dive analysis. And really, we didn't really know what we were getting into. I don't think we called it our deep dive initially, but once we realized how exhaustive of a process this would be, that's just what we were calling it. And we started working on this in late 2020, you know, during quarantine. And I really don't think we fully understood what we were undertaking. You know, the heavy lift was from Seal and myself, and we also pulled in our supervisor, Jenny Schildcox. Now, Jenny doesn't know the land use or the floodplain program quite as thoroughly as Seal and I, but she has a zoning administrator background. She could look at our regulations with a fresh set of eyes from an outsider's perspective. And if it doesn't make sense to her, you know, we can be assured that it's not going to make sense to zoning administrators out there at the local level. So her input was very helpful as well. So we met for like once or twice a week for well over a year. And I mean, these were intense meetings where we were really digging into the rules hard. So early on, we set goals, and we wanted to maintain the same basic structure of the model that you're used to seeing. We wanted to use language that was as consistent with the law as possible, you know, minimize fluff. And we wanted an ordinance that could address pretty much every conceivable type of development. You know, so if no matter what you were seeing on the ground, the ordinance spoke to that development in some kind of way. That wasn't always the case. And it just needed to be plain language. It needed to be clear and understandable. So we picked apart rule, we picked apart Code of Federal Regulations line by line, and we wanted to see what provisions were missing, you know, and those provisions that are missing, are they even appropriate for an ordinance? You know, some of these are mapping standards and others just guided procedures for the DNR. And then we just refined it. We compared these laws to the language in the ordinance, and we color coded everything by source. Yellow was from federal regulations, gray was from state rule or statute, blue are just other laws. And that might be FEMA guidance, FEMA policy, or there's other state rules that were incorporated into this ordinance. And then we dug in. And when we did, it was very obvious that we had some questions and interpretations to talk ourselves through. We scrutinized the non-highlighted items, particularly those that didn't have a source. It didn't come directly from law. And to make an ordinance work, you need this type of language to a certain extent. So if it was an unhighlighted item that resembles a standard in any kind of way, we wanted to make a point to identify it as such, as a higher standard, a clarifying standard. We wanted that crystal clear to the user that it's not necessarily a required standard. So there's many provisions that deserve the second, a third, a fourth set of eyes on them to make sure the ordinance accurately reflects them, the intent of law, and it's understandable. And we were constantly throwing out hypothetical scenarios to see how our ordinance would guide a particular type of development. Are all these relevant standards easy enough to find? And to what extent do we need to add like cross references? We had a lot of notes. And, if you saw the marked up version of this document, it was covered in notes. And then we did a review. Our internal review was very thorough. And then we convened a group of zoning administrators from around the state. We reached out to Minnesota Association of County Planning and Zoning Administrators. We convened what we called an LG work group, and we walked through some of the particularly confusing provisions. Once they had a set of eyes on it, or multiple sets of eyes on it, we shared it with FEMA. FEMA needs to okay our model. They have strong interest in what our model looks like, and they have particular interest in what our state higher standards are. So they were particularly interested in that color-coded version, because I don't think they've ever been fully clear on what standards were unique to Minnesota. And Minnesota has a lot of unique standards that other states don't have. So FEMA offered some very good input as well. And we posted the ordinance like a little over a year ago, but I'd still say that we're in the early phase of rollout. And I'm realizing that as we get more eyes on this ordinance, we're continuing to make additional tweaks, less so than we were shortly after rollout. But I mean, we're still considering it a working document. And I would guess that most folks on this call are anticipating an ordinance update in the near future. So, as you dig in, we'd love to get additional feedback if there's any provisions that don't quite make sense. So floodplain ordinances happen every so often, and mostly they're due to map updates. That's what's triggering a community to update their ordinance. And when they do, we always encourage folks to adopt the most recent version of the model ordinance when they do. And I guess about 95% of the communities that are adopting an ordinance, they probably adopt it verbatim. And that's great. We like that. And that says that these communities are placing a lot of trust in this model. But at the same time, we still want communities to scrutinize these provisions and think about their risk. I think that a lot of communities, that they might be intimidated by the ordinance because they just don't know it. They don't know to what extent they should be scrutinizing it or what they should be looking at. It's just a complex program, and they might process permits so rarely that they just want something that's compliant with state and federal standards. It's vetted, it's good to go. But when it's time to update your ordinance, I would encourage folks to think about, what your risk looks like and how this ordinance can be further customized. So the version that we post online is the version with right margin commentary. So the main ordinance language is on the left and commentary is on the right margin. And it's the same structure that we've had previously, but we spent a lot of time tweaking our right margin commentary, and we wanted to identify our sources better. And we also wanted to better explain alternative approaches that you might want to consider. Because though this is the model, there's certain provisions that a community might want to think long and hard about, tweaking. And hopefully each comment, offers some considerations that you might want to think about. We also have the blue bold, peppered throughout the ordinance. We might have provisions that we've identified in blue bold. This is an approach that we borrowed from the shoreland model ordinance, and it's been very successful. We've got good feedback on that, and that identifies optional standards. And in most cases, these are higher standards that we've recommended. We think are appropriate for most all communities out there, or they may be alternative approaches. And wherever we have items in blue bold, we have text explaining it in the right margin. And there's many opportunities for other higher standards. If you attended Monday's presentation, I think right now on our website we have last year's posted. We'll be replacing that with this year's presentation that Seal just gave on Monday. Seal had introduced a lot of different other higher standards that a community can choose to use. And the way those would get inserted into an ordinance, you might not necessarily know the best way to incorporate that standard into ordinance form, but we'll help you out. Our basic standard operating procedure when working with communities is we take the model, we customize it to your community. So if you're struggling with ordinance language, know that we're very happy to help you out. FEMA offers us support to give this kind of technical assistance to community. They want us to. So we want to encourage you, if you are at least brainstorming different types of higher standards, we're more than happy to work with you. On the screen is a couple of examples. The example on the right, Edina, they map and regulate unmapped risk. They've actually modeled localized flooding, and they have some limited standards for localized flooding. You can regulate you can regulate other areas outside the floodplain. You can regulate your 500-year floodplain. The image on the left shows how you can regulate the horizontal extent of the regulatory floodplain elevation. Take that RFPE, extend it laterally, so you're capturing areas that are just outside the map 100-year floodplain area. The types of higher standards that you're going to consider, it's really community dependent. What are your issues, and what do you want to address? How do you want to address them? What's your current risk? Do you have future growth anticipated? Are you going to be putting a whole lot more impervious surface on the water? Do you have storage issues? Do you have flooding risk downstream where you want to encourage storage? Do you have unstable streams where you're worried about channel movement? There's lots of different types of risk out there, and every community is unique. And you also have to think about your administrative capacity. Some standards are going to be tougher to administer than others. So are you prepared to administer these higher standards? And to what extent are your elected officials going to be agreeable to these higher standards? That's certainly another important question. We have graphics in our new model, and graphics are becoming more of a regular thing in ordinances. It's far more common, and there are a couple of provisions which are difficult to communicate via text, and we thought it was appropriate to show these in graphic form. And we really like the way these turned out. The first one that I had on the screen was alternative elevation standards. This standard here visually communicates your typical development on fill. And if you've attended any of our floodplain presentations the last couple of years, you've likely seen this image. This is a screen grab from MinTopo. It shows 2-foot contours. It shows the floodplain layer. And it beautifully captures how some of our floodplain maps may not always align with the on-the-ground contour elevations. So this provision that I have on the screen, it's been in the model as long as I'm aware. It's right from rule. But since we're adding graphics, we thought that this was one that was easier to show visually. And rather than recreate it, we realized that it converts to black and white pretty well. So we used this as an image instead of just creating the graphics from scratch. We thought that this captured it pretty accurate. And what this is saying basically is the floodplain overlay district, it doesn't always align perfectly with what's on the map, you know, your true on the ground contour. And we need to get in the habit of double checking our elevations. We need to know the map floodplain in our community and how closely they align with the contour. And if you aren't already, you're going to want to get familiar with sources for that 2-foot contour information. You know, we have it on our lake and flood elevations online as well as Mintopo viewer. We also added a provision in 4.2 of the model that details when is no permit needed. If you're familiar with other presentations that we've given, we talk about the definition of development. And we say that any development, which is defined, and it's defined very broadly, requires a permit, which is basically any type of activity, earth moving activity for the most part. FEMA has some guidance, and they have this class. It's called FEMA 480, and that's the source where we took this information from. That class, they talk about when no permit is needed, and that was as good of a source as we needed to clarify exactly when no permit is needed. And you know, they talk about routine maintenance, continuation of existing uses, and then they talk about insignificant uses. They give examples. Those are examples. They talk about that won't have an impact on flood flows, such as planting a garden, farming, putting up a mailbox. But you know, the way it's worded, it's largely at the discretion of the zoning administrator. You know, what you're going to call an insignificant use. So I guess if there's any doubt whether it deserves a permit, best course of action is just to require it. The floodway section gave us a lot of challenges because the state rules are they're a little confusing when it comes to uses. Now the federal standards, they don't really restrict uses in the floodway whatsoever, you know, so there's other states where you can theoretically build a building, you know, right off the channel, you know, and that's how we get, you know, houses on the beach on stilts and you know, other situations like this, like the house in this picture where it's just right off the channel. The state rules are very restrictive on the types of uses in the floodway, and the state rules are explicit on the allowable uses, but they could have been written a little bit clearer. It says that allowable uses are limited to agricultural, recreational, or open space, you know, but those aren't defined in any kind of way. They don't offer specificity in terms of what recreational means, what open space means. Now, there's other clues in terms of what that means that we've pulled from other provisions and rules, but it offers very little specificity. In the past, we've attempted to further interpret what those terms mean, but we've kind of gone back to just calling those out: agricultural, recreational, and open space. We actually further clarified open space to mean public open space uses, you know, parks and that sort of thing. But anyway, communities are certainly welcome to add specificity to those provisions, and probably encouraged to further specify the types of uses that you want to allow in floodway, you know, and as long as it fits under these categories, we're okay with it. Now, we want to also caution a community from being too permissive of those uses in the floodway, because those are the types of areas within the floodplain that have a tendency to get destroyed. So there's good basis for those provisions. There's also requirements for LOMers and CLOMers, map revisions and conditional map revisions. Those had never been previously incorporated into the ordinance, but it specifies the process for how map revisions would work. And that's been incorporated into the ordinance. We have alternative elevation methods. Now, these types of developments, you know, we have developments on fill, and then we have developments alternative to fill. What's on your screen now is highlighting some 3 different examples of alternatives to fill. The second 2, you know, the 2 on the right, those 2 types of building construction types, they get a little bit more detailed during the permit process. And construction of this type had been a little confusing in previous versions of the model. The new model clarifies that these standards, it hopefully clarifies them in a little bit more plain language. And it also references FEMA technical bulletins to ensure we're capturing all of the relevant standards. You know, those FEMA technical bulletins, they guide this type of construction. They're updated every so often. And, you know, by just referencing the documents, we're capturing those updates. Now, previous versions of the model would have always required a CUP for all development of this type, but the rules only require a CUP when it's specifically a residential structure. So for non-residential structures, we made some changes so that it only requires a basic permit. You know, in order to do this, we had to do some cross-referencing. And the reason why we did it is requiring a CUP is a disincentive to do it. You know, sometimes the CUP process can be burdensome, but we actually think that this is the preferred way to build in a floodplain. You know, when you're building on fill, you're subjecting a whole lot more disturbance on the floodplain, you know, and this is a less intrusive way to build in the floodplain. The rule only requires a CUP for anything that can't meet the basic fill requirement. You know, so let's say you have a narrow lot, you can't meet the 15-foot fill extension. You know, so you might want to consider a construction like the one on the left, or maybe you want to extend that fill out slightly, just not 15 feet out, and then you want to end it with a retaining wall or something. So you aren't meeting the 15 feet requirement. This allows an alternative to that. And in previous versions of the model ordinance, you couldn't do that. The only way you could do that is through a variance, the way it was written, strict interpretation of the way it was written previously. And we were evaluating our rule and the language of it. We changed the language in a way that our ordinance now refers to elevation methods alternative to the basic fill standards. So any kind of alternative to those fill standards, that's some variation of what's on the screen here, requires a CUP, no longer requiring a variance. That may or may not be clear to you. I don't know. If you're a community that has a lot of those narrow lots, that's probably a situation that you've encountered. Anyway, moving on. Our section for A zones, this is in section 7. It's called the General Floodplain District. This section also needed some work. And we made a number of revisions to this section and made it more of a step-by-step. And in 7.1, we break down the use limitations. Until we know the floodway and flood fringe boundaries in that A zone, allowable uses are basically restricted to whatever we have allowed if it were in a floodway. In 7.2, we're determining our base flood elevation and our regulatory flood protection elevation, which is required for, you know, just about any kind of development. And there's some good notable additions here. You know, we include a reference to best available data, including our pink line data set, which is available through Lake and Flood Elevations online viewer. And we're also clarifying what the stage increases would be, you know, since it's an A zone, it wouldn't be in the flood insurance study. In 7.3, we're doing our rise analysis. And since it's not in a detailed study, we're allowing rise up to 1/2 a foot. And this really could have been explained better in previous versions. 7.4, if it's a structure or any other type of development that would be allowed in the flood fringe, then you have to determine the floodway boundary. And the methodology we're detailing here, it differs from previous versions. You know, the state rule basically requires an engineering study to verify the extent of the floodway, but it also allows the DNR to authorize alternative methods. You know, we clarify this point, and we've adjusted what we're willing to accept for the methodology on lakes. You know, historically, we've allowed everything below the ordinary high to be categorized as floodway, and everything above it is flood fringe. However, we've seen this lead to some very significant filling activities that, you know, in some cases could lead to some impacts to flood flows. And this really goes against the intent of the provisions in most shoreland ordinances. You know, those that guide land alterations and vegetation removal. Our new model still accommodates for a streamlined method around length, one that a zoning administrator can just do themselves, as long as there's some reassurances that the disturbances of those nearshore areas are minimized. Section 12, our nonconformity section, this section needed some work too. And we mentioned that FEMA has, they've been prioritizing the need to improve administration of nonconforming structures, particularly when we're in like a post-disaster situation. So we saw some opportunities to clarify some items, both in the ordinance as well as in our sample permit application form, which was also developed as part of the process. In the ordinance, we went with kind of more of a step-by-step approach. And if you have a non-conforming structure, whether it's an expansion or repair of it, first you estimate the market value of the structure itself, you estimate the cost of the repair or improvement, and then you compare them, and if it exceeds 50%, then you are either substantially improved or substantially damaged. So you're limited to your improvement or the repair, before you bring it into compliance. So we've been working on quite a bit of guidance materials to assist zoning administrators through this process. SEAL's got a presentation on substantial damage determinations and post-flood responsibilities coming up, so I'll save the details there.
Actually, we don't have one scheduled. We were hoping to get it into the in-person.
Oh, okay. Thanks, SEAL. So like I mentioned, as part of this process, we also developed a sample permit application form. And this is something we're just as excited about as our ordinance, So we have two versions of this sample permit application. The full application is a 5-pager. The first 2 pages are completed by the applicant, and then the last 3 pages are completed by the zoning administrator. Really, as the applicant's filling it out, you would walk them through, the basics of it, and then they complete it, submit it with some plans, give it to you. And this replaces the previous form, which was a 1-pager, and it just kind of lacked, the previous form just lacked detail. But the process of completing this form along with the property owner gives you an opportunity to communicate the relevant standards, and 90% of the most significant standards are captured in this form. So ideally, you don't have to worry about missing a standard, or you shouldn't anyway, if you work through all the steps in this form. I mentioned that this is the main version. The main version is a 5-pager. We have a simplified version, which is a 3-pager, when a development does not involve a building. So here, this page here is for non-conforming structures. This page provides a little bit more backbone to your substantial damage and substantial improvement determinations. I think this is on the 4th page of the document. This is a step-by-step, the way it's worded in the ordinance. And the top section is where we evaluate our project costs. And this is a requirement for all non-conforming structures. You're working your way through the evaluations. We have check boxes to document how you're finding these numbers. Federal code doesn't have much for hard and fast rules for making these determinations, but FEMA has a 174-page document that will walk you through best practices. The amount of material that FEMA has on nonconformities is exhausting, and it's really too much for the average zoning administrator to understand. Hopefully the guidance that we've offered, which both in this form, the ordinance itself, as well as our substantial damage playbook, which we rolled out last year, hopefully simplifies that process a bit better. Yeah, so this part of the document details what for nonconformities. Our model ordinance, along with most other state model ordinances in the country, we have recommended language for tracking damages and improvements cumulatively over the life of the structure. And that's been recommended higher standards. That's been in our model for quite some time, and most communities have adopted some variation of it. However, up until recently, we haven't really offered any kind of clear guidance for carrying out this analysis. Previous improvements, previous damages cumulatively. And this form walks the zoning administrator through that look back, really the bottom portion of this form. Yeah, this would just be one way to, so I think in this example, we're looking at improvements that have been done over time. We have 3 historic improvements in 2004, 2016, 2021. We want to document those in some kind of way so we can verify that they aren't exceeding that 50% threshold. And it's identifying what the cost of the improvement is. We're determining a market value of the structure, and we're analyzing these improvements cumulatively. And the idea behind that is that we just want to limit investment in the floodplain, because these are structures that have a tendency to get destroyed, and we just want to limit exposure. It's a good standard. It's just hard to track. Hopefully this makes it a little easier. So if anyone's thinking about updating their ordinance in the near future, I want you to think about how you would gather input from your elected officials, your planning commission residents. I'd encourage anyone to read the ordinance with commentary posted on the website. And as you read through each of these provisions, particularly those that are in blue bold or have commentary, I want you to think about how your ordinance could be further customized in a way that makes sense to your community. Think about your community. I touched on these earlier, but are you a community where water storage is really important? Do you have downstream risk? Do you have a lot of unmapped areas with known risk? How accurate are the models used to map your A zone areas? Are you in a rural area with large lots and there's plenty of alternative building locations? That, if there's plenty of alternative building locations, I would highly encourage you to consider that simplified restrictive model as well. Maybe you have a community with some meandering streams, and you want to think about some higher standards to encourage development a little. We're happy to walk you through some of these considerations, and if you have questions during the process, certainly reach out. That's really all I have.